he ever wanted, including a trophy wife.
He was really in love with her. He had a strong affinity, and he lavished her with gifts.
She was the sort of person that wanted to be a rich, kept woman.
Until a brutal crime shattered their comfortable life together and exposed a sinister plot.
It looked like someone had tried to cover up the scene.
The damage was so severe that they couldn't even identify the body.
It was a mystery that would take investigators into a world of gambling and prostitution to catch a killer driven by greed.
This was not a run-of-the-mill murder. This was like something out of a Hollywood movie.
Lust, betrayal, a deadly triangle, you name it, it was involved in this case.
October 31st, 2002. It's 9 a.m. on a Monday morning in the small town of Huyton, outside of Liverpool, England. A warehouse owned by a local trading company is about to open for the day.
This warehouse is on an industrial estate, so there's no houses, it's not a residential area.
The owner of the premises, a Mr. Canavan, went to work that morning at 9 o'clock. He saw blood in the passage entrance. There were bloody footprints.
Canavan follows the trail into a back room, where he makes a horrifying discovery. Lying on the floor is the dead body of a man, and there is blood everywhere.
The local police responded, and they in turn contacted the major incident room, and I went down as the senior investigating officer to take charge of the scene. I examined the body. He was basically unrecognisable. It looked as though he'd been shot in the face. And there appeared to be shotgun damage to the ceiling. There were shotgun pellets that were recovered from the ceiling.
The damage to the victim's head is so severe that making a positive identification proves difficult.
His jacket had been partially removed, the sleeves were inside out. When we searched the victim's clothing, we found identification relating to a Gerald Gilbert.
Canavan tells police that Jed Gilbert worked for him as a sales manager. He has no idea why anyone would shoot him.
The office had a floor safe, and the cover to the floor safe had been removed, but there'd been no attempt to try and find the keys to the safe.
Had Jed interrupted a burglary in process? Or was there something more sinister at play? Everyone who knew him says 46-year-old Jed Gilbert was an industrious businessman.
Jed, no matter what anybody thought of him, good, bad or indifferent, they all said he was an amazing salesman. He could sell ice to an Eskimo.
Jed's talents earned him a good living and enabled him to buy a Victorian townhouse in the nearby town of Toobrook. But Jed hadn't let success go to his head.
He was a very, very pleasant, easygoing person.
He knew how to have a good time. He was also very successful. He just hadn't found the right person yet. It was in 1997 when Jed Gilbert met Ann Huxley.
Jed met Ann in a nightclub and they hit it off.
Jed was 41 when he met 32-year-old Ann. At first glance, they didn't have much in common and came from very different backgrounds.
Ann Huxley actually came from a part of Liverpool called Kensington, which is quite a lowly place, actually. It's quite a sort of poor working class area of Liverpool.
Unlike Jed, Ann had been married and divorced twice already.
She had a son and a daughter and lived in the Newsham Park area of Liverpool.
But they shared a strong work ethic. Ann was also an ambitious entrepreneur who operated a string of local businesses.
A brew spot, if you like, where officers could go and have a cup of coffee and one thing and another.
Ann Huxley was driven by money. She had in her mind some sort of glamorous lifestyle.
The two began dating. But while Jed was happy, his family wasn't.
Jed Gilbert's family, certainly his sister and mother, did not like Anne Huxley, and they didn't want him associating with her.
The relationship moved very fast. They had only dated for a year, and shortly thereafter, Anne moved into his townhome.
In 1998, Jed and Anne got married, but there were problems from the beginning.
Anne's marriage to Jed was certainly on the rocks and was coming to an end.
In 2002, after only 4 years of marriage, the couple divorced.
Albeit they were divorced, they were still living together in the same house, but in separate rooms.
However, the separation wouldn't last very long.
There had appeared to be some sort of reconciliation, and it looked to all intents and purposes that Anne was actually back in love with Jed and that she wanted to stay with him and make the marriage work.
But any hopes for a reconciliation are lost, now that Jed has been found brutally murdered.
That was the question on everyone's mind. I mean, why would anyone want to kill a man like Jed Gilbert?
Coming up, investigators dig beneath the surface of an estranged marriage and discover there is no shortage of suspects with a grudge against their victim.
Jed was a gambler, and by all accounts, not a very good one.
His gambling had gotten the best of him, had gotten so bad that he stole 11,000 pounds.
Police in Liverpool are investigating the brutal murder of Jed Gilbert, a 46-year-old salesman at the trading company where his body was found.
It was suspected he may have been killed with a shotgun.
Detectives recovered shotgun pellets from the ceiling, and closer inspection of the body seems to support their theory.
There was also a mark on the back of the neck, bruising, which was in the shape of the butt of a rifle or shotgun. Quite a substantial mark. We needed to do an inventory to see if anything was missing.
However, closer inspection of the crime scene suggests a different scenario.
There was no sign of a forced entry. The entry had been legitimate with a set of keys by the victim. The drawers hadn't been opened or anything like that.
And when the medical examiner moves the body, their suspicions are raised even further.
We found 2 pieces of latex which had appeared to come from a glove that had obviously ripped at some stage, and they had blood on. They were preserved and sent for analysis.
It looked like someone had tried to make the scene look like a robbery to cover up something more sinister.
In fact, it looked like the killers had come here for only one reason: to murder Jed Gilbert.
We thought that Mr. Gilbert had arrived for work at 9 o'clock and been followed in by the offenders, who probably had been lying in wait for him.
But why? While Jed's body was transported for an autopsy, investigators sit down with his ex-wife, Anne Huxley, who has just arrived on the scene.
Anne Huxley arrived at the premises searching for her husband, who she said hadn't been home all night. Huxley was what you would expect of a wife, really. Very, very emotional, upset, crying, couldn't understand why.
According to Anne, Jed went to the warehouse that day to handle a last-minute delivery. But when he didn't come home after work, Anne began to worry.
And Huxley was ringing neighbors, relatives, friends.
No one heard from Jed either. And so, of course, that really started to bother Anne. And after several hours, she started to fear the worst.
She thought perhaps he'd been in an accident, so she went to his place of work, looking for him, and that's how she arrived.
Detectives ask Anne if she can think of any reason why someone would want to harm Jed. To their surprise, she says yes.
Jed was a gambler, and by all accounts, not a very good one. And he did have debts, gambling-wise. She then said, well, he owed money to casinos.
In fact, it was Jed's gambling addiction that had caused them to divorce in the first place.
She was frightened the house was going to be repossessed to pay those debts off. So she divorced him so that he didn't have any say in the house.
She claimed that his gambling had gotten so bad that he stole 11,000 pounds from the shipping company. So his boss, Steve Canavan, might be someone they should look at as a suspect.
He was questioned quite seriously from the start because there's quite often somebody who reports the body is the person who's committed the crime.
Investigators can't rule out the possibility Jed's boss was involved. And Anne isn't finished with her list of possible enemies yet.
So after the divorce, Anne started dating another man by the name of Paul Gunning. But here's the thing. She and Jed were still living together, and Gunning didn't like that at all.
He obviously thought it was going somewhere. It wasn't.
Anne says she broke off the affair with Paul Gunning, but he wouldn't leave her alone.
Anne said it had gotten so bad that she decided to take a drastic action. She apparently asked a friend to kind of rough up Paul Gunning so that he could stop harassing her.
She actually gave us his name, Pauline.
Detectives now find themselves with a host of potential suspects.
Maybe he owed money to the wrong people. Maybe there was some sort of argument. He'd stolen money from his employers. Or maybe this was a jealous lover who had just decided to get rid of the husband.
While police consider the possibilities, the autopsy report comes in. The medical examiner has determined the cause of death, and it's not what they expected.
There was no evidence whatsoever of a firearm being used. It was sheer blunt trauma and vastly in excess of what was needed to kill somebody. Every bone in his skull had been fractured or basically obliterated. Such was the force to the head. He had a gaping hole over his left eyebrow.
The damage is too severe to have been caused by the butt of a rifle. And when police finish their inventory of the warehouse, they make an interesting discovery.
There was a fire extinguisher missing, which was quite unusual. You don't break into a warehouse to steal a fire extinguisher. It was obviously significant.
Coming up, the investigation hits one roadblock after another.
Not one single lead panned out.
Until a new suspect drops a bombshell.
He had been in a relationship with Anne Huxley.
In Huyton, England, detectives are slowly unraveling the mystery surrounding the brutal murder of 46-year-old Jed Gilbert.
So when the autopsy revealed that the injuries were caused by blunt force trauma, the investigators realized that it might have been due to a missing fire extinguisher, and that the suspect potentially took the fire extinguisher from the crime scene.
Jed's ex-wife, Anne Huxley, thought his gambling addiction may have earned him a few dangerous enemies.
Police looked into the casinos Jed had visited, but couldn't come up with any leads.
Neither the casino owners nor their debt collectors could be linked to the killing.
These were avenues that we did explore, and they came to nothing.
Police turned their attention to a second suspect, Jed's boss at the trading company, Stephen Canavan.
Anne told investigators that Jed had taken 11,000 pounds from the shipping company, implying that the owner, Steve Canavan, might have had a motive to get rid of Jed, to get rid of a problem employee. Steve
Canavan vehemently denied this.
According to Canavan, he made Jed pay back the stolen money by taking it out of his pay.
At the time of the murder, he had actually paid back £5,000.
Canavan insists he had no reason to hurt Jed. Despite the gambling problem, Jed was his most valuable employee.
Without him, he didn't have a company because he was such an outstanding salesman. He said he just couldn't replace him.
Steve Canavan's alibi checked out. For 24 hours prior to the body being found, there was nothing to suggest he was responsible.
With Canavan eliminated as a suspect, investigators take a look at another man implicated by Anne Huxley, her ex-lover, Paul Gunning.
She named him as somebody who was wanting to remove Gilbert so he could take the place.
In his interview with detectives, Gunning denies having anything to do with Jed's murder.
Paul Gunning was completely forthcoming with the police. He admitted the affair with Ann, but he said he was over it and had absolutely no motive to injure Jed.
Paul Gunning has got a cast iron alibi. He can account for all of his movements around the time and around the days of Jed Gilbert's death.
While police can find nothing to link Gunning to the murder, his business dealings with Ann Huxley are of interest to them.
So Paul Gunning owned a company, an escort company called 2020. Now, on one hand, these types of escort companies may simply be for the partnership, the companionship of a woman, but it can also be used as cover.
And according to Gunning, when he met Ann a few years earlier, she wanted a piece of the action.
Huxley applied for a job there and then ended up taking it over from him.
It seems Ann's chain of shops were actually just a clever front for a growing escort business.
Ann Huxley had a history of working in escort agencies throughout the city.
Girls would go out and work for her, and she was actually getting paid some money for that. It wasn't a sort of brothel that she was running from her home. It was more that she was taking a cut of what the girls would actually get paid when they were going out, carrying out sex work.
It was a far cry from the simple entrepreneur Ann claimed to be. And police were in for another surprise when they tracked down Ann's friend, Paul Eaton, the man who she'd asked to rough up Gunning.
Eaton was a nightclub doorman who worked in Birkenhead, which is just across the river from Liverpool.
Huxley met him when she was looking for premises to open escort agencies over in Birkenhead, and they struck up a friendship.
According to Eaton, he and Ann were much more than just friends.
It didn't take Paul Eaton long to admit that he had been in a relationship with Ann Huxley.
Eaton told police that he was in love with Ann and that they'd been on a trip to South Africa together, and it was Paul's impression that was a love that was going to last.
Eaton says the trip had inspired them to take their relationship to the next level.
During this holiday to South Africa, Paul Eaton had in fact proposed to Ann Huxley and they got engaged.
Paul Eaton had an obsession with Ann Huxley, a deep love for her maybe. So that could certainly be a motivation for murder. As she'd stated with Paul Gunning in the past, perhaps it was the case that his jealousy of the close relationship that she still had with Jed Gilbert had motivated him to kill.
But Eaton claimed he had no reason to be jealous, since Ann had accepted his proposal.
When police spoke to Paul Eaton, he denied any involvement at all.
However, his alibi doesn't hold up quite as well as their other suspects.
He gave us a convoluted story about his mother or a relative being ill and phoning his friend Paul Lewis, getting in a car, driving on the motorway to Wales to discuss his sorrow. The car not sounding too well, so they turned round and came back to Birken. They went for a drink in a nightclub. When he came back to the car, it wouldn't start. It was a real nonsense tale, really. When you listened to it, you thought, who in the right mind would produce this as an alibi?
So they tracked down Eaton's friend Lewis to see what he has to say.
They were both doormen, worked on the doors in Birkenhead. That's how they knew each other.
Lewis tells police the same story, although it doesn't ring true. It's not proof of any foul play. However, investigators are curious about one thing.
If Ann Huxley was prepared to lie about her relationship with Paul Eaton, well, what else is she prepared to lie about?
Coming up, a closer look at the grieving ex-wife finally gives detectives the break they've been searching for.
Why was his phone in Page Moss, which is the next district where the victim was murdered?
Those phone records were pretty damning evidence.
A few weeks into the investigation of Jed Gilbert's brutal murder, Liverpool police have a lot of suspicions, but no hard evidence.
Investigators had a pair of alibis from Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis, but they seemed completely implausible. Eaton had also revealed that he and Anne Huxley were engaged to be married.
There were so many levels to this murder.
If Anne Huxley was involved in a serious relationship with another man, why hadn't she mentioned that in her interview?
According to Anne, she and Jed were trying to reconcile, and she only mentioned Eaton as a friend who kind of helped her. So, what was really going on?
Investigators take a closer look at Anne's story and where she said she'd been the night Jed was murdered.
She'd gone out to a sunbed centre. She went to her sister's, her mother's, visited various relatives.
Anne told them she made a flurry of calls looking for Jed when he failed to come home from work.
When we checked Huxley's phone, all the people she'd contacted were there, the police, the ambulance, and everybody else.
But when investigators study the records further, something else jumps out.
Anne's phone records show that she called someone else, someone she had no business calling, if she was looking for her missing husband.
Significantly, amongst those was a phone call to Paul Eaton.
And a call to her new fiancé isn't all they discover.
You start delving deeper into the phone calls, the movements of the vehicles, and they become significant.
Anne's calls to Eaton had been made around the time he claimed he was on the way to Wales. But cell tower activity indicates he was somewhere else.
Why was his phone in Page Moss, which is the next district to Huyton, where the victim was murdered? So we looked at that, and then we looked at the story that Paul Eaton had given us of where he was and his movements on the night. And obviously, he'd lied to us. He'd been over in Huyton at the time, round about midnight, the time of the murder.
Those phone records were pretty damning evidence, and not just against Paul Eaton. So, what was Anne Huxley's real role in all of this?
We first started looking seriously at Eaton, and then obviously we had to start looking at Huxley.
According to Anne, in early 2002, Jed's gambling caused her to divorce him to keep from losing their home, but they were trying to work things out. But when investigators talk to Jed's family, they paint an entirely different picture.
They said that Jed's gambling didn't make Anne afraid. In fact, it just made her really mad. There was no reconciliation.
From talking to members of the family and relatives, she'd had enough of him. She just divorced him.
According to relatives, Anne had only continued to live with Jed because she needed his money.
He paid £150 a week rent. So basically, he was just keeping the roof over the head.
So relatives said that after the divorce, Jed and Anne slept in separate bedrooms, and Anne had her own occasional male visitors.
To quote friends of Gilbert's, she basically treated him like a doormat.
This had continued for over 6 months, right up to Jed's death. And one of the boyfriends they name is Anne's now fiancé, Paul Eaton.
She brought Paul Eaton back to the house while Gilbert was there. I mean, it just defies description, really.
However, one of Jed's friends tells police that in the summer of 2002, he had dinner with Jed and Anne.
He said he couldn't believe the transformation. Suddenly, she was all over him and was fawning all over him and saying, oh, yes, we're back in love and we're going to remarry.
If we believe Paul Eaton that he and Anne Huxley are engaged, why is she trying to get back together with her ex-husband, Jed Gilbert?
When detectives check the couple's finances, they uncover some suspicious behavior in the weeks leading up to Jed's death.
She suddenly arrives at an insurance agent's, takes a £400,000 life insurance cover over the two of them, and if one of them passes away, suddenly the other one gets $400,000. She then goes to a solicitor, has wills drawn up where he signs everything over to her, lock, stock and barrel. And that was in the August. And then 6 weeks later, he's murdered.
To detectives, Anne looks like a bitter divorcee who lured her ex-husband into a deadly trap to collect on his life insurance. Their suspicion grows after some of Eaton's friends describe Anne's behavior when they returned from their trip to Africa.
When they came back, she was sporting an engagement ring, which she was showing everybody in the nightclubs in Birkenhead.
Investigators follow up with the owner of the club in Birkenhead. He remembers Eaton and his friend Lewis coming in after the murder, and they brought something rather strange.
They had a fire extinguisher with them, and the adjoining premises was a galvanising factory, and they had vats of acid, and they went over the fence and threw the fire extinguisher into one of the vats.
There's too much of a coincidence. That had to be the missing fire extinguisher. And if it were, then of course you would try to destroy it because it could be the murder weapon.
Police contact the factory and have the vats drained.
We actually recovered the fire extinguisher from the vat. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been damaged severely, but it hadn't been destroyed.
That's a major breakthrough in the case. If they can prove that the fire extinguisher was used to kill Jed Gilbert, that puts Eaton and Lewis in possession of the murder weapon.
Test results from the bloody latex found underneath Jed's body provide further evidence against the pair.
The 2 pieces of latex was confirmed that they'd come from a glove.
The pieces of latex were examined, and they had the DNA of Paul Lewis on them.
It wasn't a massive amount, but it was enough to say that Lewis had worn those gloves and was at the crime scene and must have been involved in the murder.
Coming up, a suspect cracks and a new witness comes forward.
The pair of them set about beating Jed Gilbert to death.
Two months after the murder of Jed Gilbert, police believe they have a solid case against Ann Huxley's fiancé, Paul Eaton, and his friend, Paul Lewis.
All these things were coming together, which put them very, very firmly in the frame as suspects.
But detectives are convinced Ann played a role as well.
Ann Huxley admitted to using Eaton to beat up another ex-lover. So you have to wonder, has she orchestrated another attack, but this time to get rid of her husband?
The question is, can they prove it? On December 16th, 2002, 6 weeks after Jed's murder, Eaton and Lewis are arrested and brought in for interrogation. Eaton is the first to crack.
He admitted to going to the premises, but he went there merely to warn Gilbert of pestering Huxley because she wanted no more to do with him. And he was a boyfriend. He was taking over.
Eaton was hopelessly infatuated with Ann Huxley, and he had said he had gone to tell him to stay away from her.
According to Eaton, Jed reacted violently, pulling out a shotgun. Eaton claims he had no choice but to fight back.
He wrestled and it went off. And he then hit him with a fire extinguisher.
It wasn't exactly self-defense because he was trespassing, but Eaton is making it sound as though it was all heat of the moment and that it's not his fault.
Meanwhile, police are questioning Lewis in another room. He tells a similar story.
Lewis said he waited in the car outside, heard noises, shouting and a bang, and went inside and saw the victim on the floor and Eaton hitting him with a fire extinguisher.
If you hit someone in the head with a fire extinguisher, they're going to stay down. So why continue to hit them?
It was just a nonsense tale. We managed to disprove everything that they said. We went through the DNA in the latex gloves. No answer for that. Didn't know what to say.
Eaton and Lewis also failed to mention Ann Huxley. So the next day, investigators decide to bring her in as well.
So Ann keeps repeating the same thing that she had already given to the investigators. She's just a grieving widow, and there's no reason for them to suspect that she'll be involved in the murder.
Huxley basically said she knew nothing about it. He was going there for a business deal and she stuck to that.
Detectives want to know why Ann didn't tell them about her engagement to Eaton, or the life insurance she'd taken out on her estranged husband weeks before he was murdered.
How does she explain having a £400,000 insurance policy taken out 6 or 7 weeks prior to his death and making a new will and signing everything over to her? And as you realise from what I've been saying, she orchestrated everything. Without her, there wouldn't have been a murder.
Anne denied absolutely any involvement in it and said that, you know, it must have been Paul Eaton who was so infatuated with her. He had taken matters into his own hands without any conspiracy from her, without any instigation from her. He had simply become a jealous lover.
Investigators aren't convinced, but her accusations seem to be supported by one of Eaton's friends, who comes forward with new testimony against him.
The witness said that Eaton told her he went to the warehouse intending on shooting Jed with a sawed-off shotgun. But at the last minute, he just couldn't do it.
Eaton is not a tough guy. From what we've learned about Eaton, we don't think he had the guts or fortitude to do that.
The witness says that Eaton told her Jed was the one who grabbed the gun. And as the two men struggled, Lewis came inside to help.
It was Paul Lewis that actually went and got the fire extinguisher from its holder on the wall. And then the pair of them set about beating Jed Gilbert to death.
Eaton's friend asked Paul why he did it, and he said he just did it for the money.
She promised Eaton and Lewis £100,000 between them for committing the murder.
Her testimony not only gives police enough to charge Eaton and Lewis, it verifies their suspicions that Ann was behind the plot to kill her ex-husband.
This is the same woman who's already admitted that she's already manipulated Eaton into committing another attack. She knew that he was madly in love with her, infatuated with her, so prepared to do almost anything for her.
She was nicknamed at the end of the inquiry the Black Widow.
Anne Huxley was considered by police to be the instigator of this, and she was charged with conspiracy to commit murder.
Eaton and Lewis were both charged with the murder of Gerald Gilbert.
Coming up, as the trial gets underway, one of the defendants makes a dramatic announcement.
I knew this was going to thrust the whole trial into chaos.
After days of interrogation, Liverpool police have charged 3 co-conspirators with the murder of 46-year-old Jed Gilbert, his ex-wife Ann Huxley, her lover Paul Eaton, and his friend Paul Lewis. In April of 2004, the trial begins.
When Ann Huxley was in court, she tried hard to present herself dress-wise as a middle-aged housewife, and that was the image she tried to project in court. She didn't succeed.
The prosecution paints Ann as a vengeful black widow. Angered by her husband's gambling debts, she divorced him, only to plot a deadly scheme to get rich.
She was going to stop at nothing to make sure that she got that £400,000 in her hands at some stage.
She promised Eaton and Lewis £100,000 between them for committing the murder.
They have witness testimony from a friend of Eaton's who says he told her all about this plot to kill Jed Gilbert.
Prosecutors also call another friend of Eaton's to the stand. He testifies that he drove Eaton and Lewis to the warehouse that night thinking they were repossessing a car.
Now, he thought nothing of this because Lewis and Eaton had in the past repossessed cars for insurance companies.
He said the 2 men told him to park nearby and just wait for the call. Fortunately, he parked near a cell tower.
About 20 minutes later, he received a phone call from Eaton and Lewis saying, "Come and pick us up."
He says that when Eaton and Lewis got back in the car, however, he realized he'd been duped.
He couldn't remember which one had the blood on the shoes, but one of them did, and they were referring to having beaten somebody up or assaulted somebody.
The gun was dumped in the River Mersey on the way back from an attack. Police have never found that gun.
Since Eaton is the one charged with the actual murder, he is the first to present his defense.
It was obvious that something quite dramatic was going to unfold.
Eaton's defence barrister stood up and said he wanted to change his plea to guilty.
He had taken a sawn-off shotgun along with him, and he had taken it there just to threaten Jed.
The consequences for Paul Eaton were massive. If you admit to murder in England and Wales, you automatically get a life sentence.
So the real question here is, why did Eaton confess? Some believe that he knew he was in too deep and he was going away anyway. Others think that he was trying to protect Anne.
This was a woman who he was actually deeply, deeply in love with. I think the thought, actually, of having to stand up in court and drop her in a whole lot of trouble was just too much for him to bear.
Wonder if I could bring them to live. I could bring my lover. And baby, you make me wait. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. Now here I go, going back on the road. When you back there again, play the music back there again. I saw the looking out of the window. Wonder if I could bring them down. If I could bring my love now, baby, you made.
Shorty, if you really wanna go, baby, then you gotta take me the mess. I tried to soak in all the years and take it all in, but I come up for a breath and cry. I gave my drama, gave my